In this video, we'll see how to create an isometric landscape diagram like this. These diagrams are a great way to highlight specific parts and showcase your design. For this beginner-friendly tutorial, we'll be using SketchUp and Photoshop for this diagram. I'm Salman, an architect and an illustrator. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon for notification. So let's get started. Before beginning with the actual diagram, I have made some rough concept sketches to get an idea of where to begin with. This is an important part because it saves us a lot of time in this extensive process and it gives a clear vision of what we're trying to achieve.
Let's begin by modeling this design in SketchUp. This model does not need to be very detailed and it can only be a block diagram to represent the design. I'm using the 3-point curve option in SketchUp to create the bridge. Let's add the bridge into a separate group, and then with the 2-point arc tool, I'm creating the edges for the other landscape parts in the diagram. We'll have to create a scene for this diagram, and for that, let's go to Camera and choose the parallel projection. Let's also choose the ISO option in the views, and once we adjust the view to the preferred angle, we can then go to View, Animation and Add Scene. We can then use the push tool to create varying heights in this landscape design. Let's add some depth to the bridge as well, which is in a separate group as of now.
The level of detail that you can add to the diagram depends on your own personal preference, but we can add some specific details like the handrail over the bridge, which can make the diagram look interesting.
To do that, we'll be using this free plugin called JHS Power Bar. For this, we'll first need to copy the edge line of the bridge and place it separately. We'll also need to model a simple railing that we intend to place on the bridge. Let's open the JHS Power Bar, which looks like this. Let's select the edge line first and then choose this option called Copy Along Path. With that, we'll have to click over the railing model and that will place it along this line. We can then make this into a separate group and place it over the main bridge model. Similarly, we can do the same for all the other edges of the bridge. Now to create the handrail over the railing, we need a simple face rectangle and use the Follow Me tool to create it. Let's increase the height of the main model and then we are ready to move on to the next step. We now need to mark each part of the model with distinct colors on which we intend to add different textures in Photoshop. In this case, I'm adding blue for the water, green for the grass and landscapes, pink and magenta for the rocks and pavements. Also adding some edges to the rock boundary so it looks more credible. Once done, we need to head over to Styles and inside the Edit tab, let's turn off the edges.
We can use these distinct colors almost like a material ID and add specific textures over them in Photoshop.
The rest of the settings can be as it is and we can zoom in a bit so that it fits the screen. We can update the scene and export it as a PDF file. Another technique in this is to export different parts of the model as a separate PDF file so that it's easier to work in Photoshop. In this case, I'm exporting the entire model as one PDF, the model without the bridge as a separate PDF, and the bridge as another PDF.
This will depend on the complexity of the model that you're working on.
I also added a brown color to the floor below the water, which can be detailed in Photoshop, and I've also saved the water separately.
Now let's jump into Photoshop where the fun part begins.
I'm creating an A3 file for this diagram. The first step is to place all the separate PDFs into this file, resize and place it at the exact position if needed. We now need different textures that we want to add into this diagram.
To create the kind of diagram that we intend, where most of the textures look three-dimensional, I use Pinterest to search for these.
Instead of choosing flat 2D textures, I use these keywords like grass in perspective. This will give us results of grass which are in perspective, and adding these into our diagram will add more depth to it. I spent some time to save a couple of these similar images and I look for some variations in these grasses like colors, textures and so on. This might look like a bit of work, but the smarter way is to create your own library by saving these so that the next time we work on it, it makes the job much easier. After we've saved these grass textures, let's choose the one that we intend to use, right click and open it with Photoshop. This opens the grass in a separate file and we'll have to define it as a pattern to be used in the diagram. Let's go to Edit and choose Define Pattern. You could rename the grass texture here and press OK. This pattern is now ready to use in our diagram. Once we've done that, let's head back to the Photoshop file. I'm using the base diagram without the bridge to begin with. We'll have to rasterize the PDF and select one part of the green area using the magic wand tool, the shortcut W. Go to the adjustments layer on the bottom right of Photoshop and choose Pattern. This will open the pattern fill and using this drop down, choose the texture that we previously made as a pattern. This will add it over the selection. We now need to tweak the settings so that it falls into place. Let's adjust the angle and also the scale below. I intend to make this grass seem like in perspective. So the grass texture looks bigger on the right side and it gets smaller on the left side. The texture might have some seams in between them, but it doesn't really matter as we go forward. Let's do the same for the other part. Select the base texture, choose a green part using the magic wand tool, add a pattern layer from the adjustment tab, and then choose the texture that we previously made as a pattern. On this one, I'm using the grass texture with some flowers on it. Let's adjust the angle and scale to fit in and press OK. Similarly, let's do the same for the other green parts as well. On the top, I'm using a texture with some ground cover on it. And for this part, let's reuse the same grass texture that we did initially. For the vertical edges on the diagram, let's look for a stone texture that forms the boundary wall. Define the pattern with this texture, go back to the base layer on Photoshop, choose the pink edges and add a pattern layer over it. I'm repeating this process separately for both the vertical and horizontal edges so that there's a separation between both these edges in the final diagram. It's also a good practice to rename the layers as you're working on it so that it's easier to access and edit them in case you have any changes.
Speaking of organizing things, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives that offers in-depth learning on topics like graphic design, illustration, photography, and so on. These can really make anyone go from beginner to pro in a matter of few hours. As architects and designers who juggle between multiple tasks, we understand the importance of organization and maximizing our productivity. And for me, who's been creating illustrations and content creation full-time, I wanted to learn Notion to help me organize my daily tasks. This is where the Notion Masterclass by Ali Abdal on Skillshare has helped me achieve my goal. Notion did seem a bit complicated for me, but this class really helped me break down the platform, giving insights on each function and how they come together to keep our daily tasks organized and accessible. Apart from these, if you're looking to learn architecture softwares or illustrations, then Skillshare is the place to go to take your career or hobbies to the next level. And the first 500 people to click the link in the description can get 1 month free trial of Skillshare. So make sure to check it out today.
I intend to add a wooden texture on this pathway right here, and for that I've saved a wooden texture on Pinterest, defined it as a pattern and added it into this magenta part right here.
Sometimes this technique of defining a pattern might not work with a few textures.
For example, this pavement pattern right here has very defined vertical and horizontal lines.
So making it as a pattern might not follow the proper angle in the diagram. Instead, here's another technique that you can follow.
Let's add the image onto the Photoshop file, rasterize it and resize it a bit smaller. Now select the texture using the selection tool, the shortcut M, press V and then hold Alt to drag the texture. This will duplicate the texture in the same layer without creating a new one. Let's do the same and make the texture longer to fit in this pavement part. Now press Ctrl T for the transformation settings. On top we have the angle settings on which you can type -30. The next tab is a height and that can be 30. Once you type in these numbers, the 2D texture automatically turns into isometric view. We can then place it on top of the layer, head over to the Layers tab, hold Alt and place your cursor between both these layers and you will see the mask option. Press the left mouse button holding the Alt and this will create a mask on the base layer. Now you can see that the texture is perfectly placed on the base layer below. You can also scale it and adjust it as you want. So this is another alternate technique to place textures into the diagram in case the textures are more defined and geometric. For the blue parts of the diagram, I have saved the simple water texture from Google. Let's start by defining it and adding the pattern on the top part of the blue. Let's reduce the opacity of this layer. Let's go back to another base layer that we created, which has the brown texture. Make a selection of the brown texture, and this is the part where we want to add the ground below the water. For this, I'm adding a ground cover texture and we'll have to place this layer below the water layer that we did previously. This will give a kind of a transparency effect for water. Now we can select the left and right sides of the blue layer and add water texture to it as well. Let's also select the right edges of the diagram and add a solid color from the adjustment layer. Let's turn on the bridge layer that we've saved separately. I wouldn't be adding any texture to the bridge layer. Instead, let's add a hue saturation. That is located in the adjustment tab as well. You can move the slider to adjust the color, and to make this adjustment only affect the layer below it, we'll have to select this icon right here. I'm trying to create a bit of an orange shade walkway, and once done, we can also save the handrail separately from SketchUp and add it on top of the bridge. We've added textures to all parts of the diagram, and now here's a simple way to add shadows. Let's go back to the SketchUp file and turn on the shadows from View, Shadows. We can adjust the angle of the shadows as we want. And once you're happy with the direction of the shadows, we'll have to go to styles and choose this style called hidden lines. Go to edit and turn off the edges, and we have the shadows separately. We'll have to export these shadows as a JPEG image and not a PDF. Once we have exported that, we can simply drag and drop the shadows onto the main diagram. Change the blend mode of these shadows to multiply, and that will pass through the diagram. Let's make the shadows a bit more realistic. Choose the shadow layer, and now let's open a basic soft brush. The color can be light gray, and let's start brushing over the base edges of the shadows. Also brush over the edges that look abrupt and make them softer. I'm also creating a new layer to add shadows on the bottom edge of the seabed.
Here comes the part where we add vegetation to the diagram. For this, we'll be adding PNGs of trees and plants. I prefer Google to search for these since it offers a variety to choose from.
A simple technique that I follow here is to search for tree PNG in the Google Images. Now before choosing a tree, go to Tools, Colors and choose Transparent. This will segregate all the JPEG images from the PNGs. You can then download a bunch of trees in different colors and variations and save it to your collection. We can also check out Pinterest where we have a variety of trees. Let's start by placing them on the top. I'm choosing Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation to adjust the colors of the tree to match with the grass that we added. To copy the tree around, we can simply hold Alt and drag, and this will create a copy in new layer. Make sure to create a variation by adjusting the heights of the trees as we're copying it so that it doesn't look too monotonous. Let's add some shrubs to cover the bases of the tree, adding a different kind of tree to the next level in the landscape to create a variation. Let's add a tall tree here that kind of passes through the center of the bridge. We can erase the base of the tree along the edge of the bridge so that it seems more natural. Make sure to adjust the hue saturation of the trees wherever needed so that it fits in with the rest of the vegetation. Some smaller plants and bushes to fill up the rest of the areas. We can also add small furnitures like benches, and a simple technique that I follow is to download a SketchUp model of a bench, place it in parallel projection, simply take a screenshot of it and add it onto the Photoshop file. Some PNGs of birds as well. This process of adding life to your scene can be up to your own personal interpretation, so you can get creative as much as you want. Adding here some tall bushes that cover the central part of the bridge.
Now, let's populate the scene with human figures.
For this, I would recommend this website called pimpmydrawing.com. Here, we have a bunch of free vector figures that we can easily download and add into our scene. So let's download a few for our diagram. Now, all we have to do is to simply drag and drop it into the Photoshop file. We can resize this to fit into the scale. Similarly, I'm adding a bunch of other diagrams as well, along the bridges, the walkways, and in the pavement on top. Once done, let's add all of them into a group. Right click and open blending options, and here let's turn on the stroke option to create an outline for these human figures. Let's also rename the group. Now the landscape part can also have some rocks that are placed at different parts of the diagram. You can get a bit quirky and add some fishes into the water as well. Better late than never, always make it a point to rename the layers or at least add specific colors to the layers so that it's easier to access them and make corrections. This also makes your file look neat. The bridge looks plain, so I'm searching for an old texture in Pinterest, right click and copy it and place it onto the Photoshop file. Let's adjust the angle and make it isometric. Copy the texture around to fill up the entire bridge. Make a selection of the bridge layer by holding down Ctrl and pressing the layer. Choose the old texture layer. Press Ctrl Shift and I to invert it. Now press Delete to remove the areas outside of the bridge. Now changing the blend mode of the layer will create different effects on the bridge. You can choose the one that suits, and I am choosing the soft light. Let's add some depth to the bridge as well. So I'm selecting the bridge, creating a new layer, changing the blend mode to multiply, and using a soft brush in grey color, I'm brushing over the edges of the bridge. We can gradually increase to darker shades of grey to get a realistic output. We can also enhance the other textures by creating a new layer over it and changing the blend mode to multiply for darker colors or overlay for lighter colors. Now, the segregation between both faces of the stone texture can be made more evident, and for that, I'm selecting the vertical faces of the stone texture and adding an exposure layer. Click this button to add it to the layer below it, and that makes a significant difference. To add more realism, you can choose the grass layer, the colors on the left side to be black on the foreground and white on the background. Use the eraser tool with a rough brush and simply brush over it. You can also find grass brushes on the internet for free, so you could use that as well. This will make the edges more softer, and that plays an important role in the realism of the diagram. I'm also adding a ground texture on the section cut areas to add more character to it. Also adding a level adjustment layer to the left and right side of the water texture to create a demarcation. Similar to what we did previously, we can also create a new layer, change the blend mode to multiply, and use a soft brush to draw over the edges of water. We can also add some white highlights over the water texture. I'm increasing the depth of the vertical layers in the diagram by drawing over with a soft brush. We can also create a new layer, place it below the humans group, and draw some shadows along the direction. We can also do the same for the individual trees to add some depth. Finally, I'm creating a new layer with the blend mode in overlay, and with a light shade of yellow, let's simply brush over different parts of the diagram. This will add some variation in the grass textures. And with that, we have the final results.
So that was it from the process of creating isometric landscape diagrams. I hope you found this video to be helpful, and if you did, please hit that like button and share this with your friends. You can follow me on Instagram and the handle is right here. I'll see you on the next one.